The stale, perfumed air of the Bentley felt like a shroud, clinging to Nina's skin with the same suffocating weight as Richard's hand on her thigh. Every mile marker on the interstate was a tombstone marking another moment of her life she'd never get back. His knuckles were white where he gripped her, a casual display of ownership that sent a familiar tremor of ice through her veins. They were returning from one of his business dinners, a 3-hour ordeal where she'd played the part of the adoring, silent fiancée, a beautiful prop for his portfolio of success. The smile she had worn felt like it had been carved into her face with a shard of glass, and the muscles in her cheeks ached with the effort of holding it in place. The long sleeves of her silk blouse, elegant and demure, hid the constellation of bruises on her arms, a fresh galaxy of pain from the previous night's argument over a misplaced set of keys. Richard liked everything in its place, especially her. A low fuel light blinked on the dashboard, a tiny, insistent pulse of amber in the opulent darkness of the car. Richard sighed, a sound of pure annoyance. Incompetent. My assistant was supposed to have this handled. He took the next exit, the smooth glide of the luxury vehicle a stark contrast to the lurching panic in Nina's chest. An exit meant a stop. A stop meant a public place. A public place meant a chance. The thought was a dangerous spark in the tinderbox of her mind, one she tried to extinguish almost as soon as it appeared. Hope was a traitor. It had betrayed her before. The gas station was an island of fluorescent light in the velvety blackness of the rural night. It was old, a little grimy, with 2 pumps and a small, cluttered convenience store. Parked near the air pump, like a pack of slumbering metallic beasts, were 6 Harley-Davidsons. Chrome gleamed under the buzzing lights, a universe away from the polished silver of the Bentley. Standing beside them was a group of men, their forms broad and imposing even from a distance. Leather vests, adorned with patches she couldn't quite make out, were their armor. One man, larger than the rest, laughed, the sound a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. They were Hell's Angels. Nina knew the look, the aura of untamed danger that clung to them like the scent of road dust and gasoline. They were the kind of men Richard sneered at, calling them Neanderthals and lowlifes. They were also the kind of men who looked like they feared nothing. Richard pulled up to the far pump, his distaste palpable. He killed the engine and turned to her, his eyes cold and flat. "Stay in the car. Don't look at them." His voice was a low command, not a request. It carried the unspoken thread of consequences, a promise of pain that was as certain as the sunrise. He got out, the automatic lock clicking shut with a sound of finality, sealing her inside her mobile prison. Nina watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He swiped his credit card with practiced ease, his movements stiff with arrogance. He was pointedly ignoring the bikers, but Nina couldn't. Her gaze was drawn to them, to their casual freedom, the way they leaned against their bikes, sharing cigarettes and jokes. They were everything he wasn't, raw, real, unbound. One of them, the big one with a thick, braided beard that reached his chest, caught her eye. He wasn't staring, just a glance, but his eyes, deep-set and surprisingly observant, seemed to see past the tinted window, past the expensive clothes, and right into the cage where her soul was rattling. For a split second, their gazes locked. In that moment, the carefully constructed dam of her composure cracked. A wave of pure, unadulterated desperation washed over her. It was now or never. Richard was distracted, his back to her, fumbling with the gas cap. Her hand, trembling so hard she could barely control it, found the manual lock. She pulled it up. The click was deafening in the silence. She pushed the door open, the cool night air shock to her system. "I said stay in the car." Richard's voice was a whip crack. He was turning, his face contorting into a mask of fury. There was no time. She scrambled out, stumbling on legs that felt like jelly. The big biker, the one who had seen her, had pushed off his bike. His name, she'd later learn, was Grizz, and his expression was a mixture of confusion and concern. He took a half step toward her. Nina didn't run. She couldn't. Instead, she lurched towards him, a moth drawn to a dangerous flame. She saw the patch on his vest now, a skull with wings, and below it, sergeant-at-arms he was close enough to touch. Richard was shouting her name, a furious, guttural roar. "Nina, get back here now." She reached Grizz, her small, trembling hand grabbing the thick leather of his forearm. The material was worn and solid beneath her fingers. He flinched, surprised, his muscles tensing under her grip. His friends had gone silent, all eyes on her. She looked up into his face, into those startlingly intelligent eyes, and the words tumbled out of her, a raw, broken whisper torn from the deepest part of her. "Please," she breathed, the single word carrying the weight of years of silent screams. "Please, I can't take more." Her grip tightened for a second, a desperate, frantic plea. Then Richard was there, his hand clamped down on her arm like a vice, the same arm he'd bruised the night before. Pain, sharp and blinding, exploded from her shoulder to her fingertips. She cried out a small, wounded sound. "Get your hands off my fiancé!" Richard snarled at Grizz, yanking Nina back so hard she slammed against his chest. He was a good head shorter than the biker, but his venom was potent. Grizz didn't move. His eyes flickered from Richard's brutal grip on Nina's arm to the sheer terror in her eyes, then back to the faint, yellowing bruise peeking out from under her collar. He saw the way she flinched, the way her body tried to curl in on itself, a subconscious effort to become a smaller target. He said nothing, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. His gaze was like granite. "We're leaving," Richard spat, dragging Nina back toward the Bentley. He shoved her into the passenger seat with no ceremony, the door slamming shut like a gunshot. He strode around the car, shot one last look of pure hatred at the silent bikers, and got in. The engine roared to life, and the tires squealed as he peeled out of the gas station, leaving the Hells Angels standing in a cloud of exhaust and sudden, heavy silence. Inside the car, the only sound was Nina's ragged breathing and the low growl of the engine. Richard didn't speak for a full minute, his hands strangling the steering wheel. When he finally did, his voice was deceptively calm, a low, silky tone that terrified her more than his shouting ever could. "You will regret that," he whispered. "You will learn that there is no one to help you. There is only me," and, as the gas station lights disappeared in the rearview mirror, Nina squeezed her eyes shut, the feel of the solid leather on the biker's arm, the last sensation of hope she had, a hope she was certain was about to be beaten out of her for good. The remaining bikers watched the Bentley's taillights vanish into the oppressive darkness. The forced laughter and easy camaraderie of moments before had evaporated, replaced by a tense, grim quiet. The air itself seemed to have grown colder, heavier. Grizz stood frozen for a long moment, his arms still tingling where the woman had grabbed him. He could still feel the frantic, bird-like flutter of her pulse through the thick leather of his cut. He slowly unclenched his fist, his knuckles white. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. What the hell was that? A younger member, a prospect named Stitch, asked, his voice hushed. Another biker, a grizzled veteran with a scar that bisected his eyebrow, spat on the pavement. "You saw what it was. That suit's got her on a short leash." Grizz finally turned to face them, his expression unreadable. But the man who knew him best, the club president, saw the storm gathering in his eyes. Rook had been watching the entire exchange from his position, leaning against the brick wall of the convenience store, a half-smoked cigarette dangling from his lips. He was wiry where Grizz was massive, his movements economical and precise. Tattoos snaked up his neck from beneath the collar of his shirt, intricate patterns of ink that told a story of a life lived on the edge. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, missed nothing. He pushed off the wall and walked over, the jingle of a chain attached to his wallet the only sound. He stopped in front of his sergeant-at-arms. "Talk to me, Grizz," Rook said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded attention without ever needing to be raised. Grizz looked at his president, his brother. Rook, the look in her eyes. I've seen it before, he didn't need to elaborate. They had all seen it, in one form or another. The look of a cornered animal, the hollowed-out expression of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to not be afraid. But it was the words she had whispered that echoed in Grizz's mind. She said she couldn't take more, he said, his voice tight. Grabbed my arm like she was drowning. Rook took a long drag from his cigarette, the cherry glowing brightly in the dim light, illuminating the hard lines of his face. He was thinking. His mind was a steel trap, always analyzing, always assessing threats. A domestic dispute was messy. It was a hornet's nest. Most people, even most cops, would look the other way. But the Hells Angels of this charter operated under a different code, Rook's Code. And that code had a zero-tolerance policy for men who hurt women and children. It was a line carved in stone, forged in a fire that still burned deep inside him. "You get a plate?" Rook asked, his tone all business. Grizz nodded. Memorized it. A custom vanity plate. Sterling 1. Rook's eyes narrowed. Sterling. The name was familiar. He filed it away for later. The car. New Bentley. Silver. Looked like a Continental GT, Grizz supplied. Man was maybe 5'10", slick suit, expensive watch. Looked like money, smelled like a snake. Rook nodded slowly, processing the information. He looked around at his men. He saw the same cold anger reflected in their eyes. They were predators, every one of them, but their prey was not the weak or the innocent. They were wolves who hunted other wolves. "All right," Rook said, flicking his cigarette but into the darkness. It arced through the air like a tiny, dying star. "Stitch, you and Hammerhead back to the clubhouse. Tell Chopper I need him. Now." No detours. The two bikers nodded. No questions asked. They swung their legs over their bikes, the engines barking to life in a synchronized roar that shattered the silence. They peeled out, their taillights following the same path the Bentley had taken, but their purpose was vastly different. Rook turned back to Grizz and the remaining two members. "We're going for a ride, but we're keeping our distance. Let's see where Mr. Sterling keeps his cage." The decision was made. There was no debate, no discussion of the risks. A call for help had been made, and they were answering. As they mounted their own Harleys, the deep, guttural thunder of the engines was not a sound of aggression, but a promise. They followed, melting into the highway, their headlights cutting through the night. They stayed a half-mile back, a pack of shadowy hunters tracking their quarry. Rook led them, his mind already working, piecing together the fragments of a plan. He had a name, a vehicle, and a victim. Now, he needed a location. They tracked the Bentley for 20 miles until it turned off the main highway and onto a winding road that led up into the hills overlooking the city. The area grew more affluent with every turn, the houses becoming larger, set further back from the road, hidden behind gates and walls. Finally, the Bentley's brake lights flared as it slowed to approach a massive set of wrought iron gates. A keypad glowed on a stone pillar. The gates swung open silently, and the car disappeared down a long, tree-lined driveway. Rook pulled his bike over to the shoulder, cutting the engine. The others followed suit, the sudden silence unnerving. They were a quarter-mile from the entrance, shrouded in the shadows of overgrown pine trees. Grizz pulled up alongside him. "That's a fortress, Rook." The wall was at least 10 feet high, topped with what looked like razor wire. Cameras were visible, perched like metallic vultures on the gateposts. "Every cage has a door," Rook said softly, his pale eyes fixed on the distant gates. He pulled out his phone, the screen's glow illuminating the grim set of his jaw. He dialed a number. "Chopper, you with me?" Loud and clear, Prez. A voice crackled back, tinny through the phone speaker. "Got a name for you. Sterling. Custom plate, Sterling 1. Find me an address. And find me everything you can on the name." Now there was a pause, then the sound of furious typing. "Sterling. Richard Sterling. CEO of Sterling Financial Corporation. Big player. Lot of money, lot of connections. Hold on, pulling DMV records for the plate. Got it. The address is 1140 Cypress Ridge Lane. You sitting outside it right now?" "Looks like it," Rook confirmed. "What else you got?" "This guy's clean on paper," Chopper said. "No criminal record. Couple of messy divorces, sealed settlements. Charity galas, big donations to the police benevolent fund. He's well insulated. Nobody's that clean," Rook growled. "Day deeper. Financials, associates, ex-employees. Find the dirt." I want to know where he sleeps, what he eats, and who he pays to keep his secrets. On it, boss, the line went dead. Rook stared at the impenetrable fortress, a cold, hard knot tightening in his gut. This was worse than he thought. The man wasn't just a bully. He was powerful, protected by layers of wealth and influence. This wouldn't be a simple matter of kicking down a door. This would require precision, intelligence, and absolute ruthlessness. He thought of the woman's terrified face, her desperate whisper. "I can't take more." He looked at Grizz, whose massive frame seemed to vibrate with contained fury. "We watch," Rook commanded. "We learn the patterns, the security rotations, the staff. We don't move until we know every inch of this place. This monster has built himself a castle. We're going to be the ones to tear it down." They settled in for a long night, two silent sentinels on the edge of a private kingdom, their mission clear. The hunt had begun. The moment the Bentley's tires crunched onto the gravel of the long driveway, the fragile shield of numbness Nina had wrapped around herself shattered. The click of the door locks disengaging was the sound of her sentence beginning. Richard didn't say a word as he got out and came around to her side, yanking the door open. He hauled her out of the car, his fingers digging into the tender flesh of her upper arm, right on the bruises he'd put there the night before. She gasped a sharp intake of breath, but made no other sound. She had learned long ago that noise only made it worse. The house loomed before them, a modernist masterpiece of glass and steel. It was beautiful, a feature in architectural magazines, but to Nina, it was a mausoleum. The floor-to-ceiling windows weren't for views. They were to ensure she was always visible, always monitored. The open-plan living space wasn't for entertaining. It was to eliminate any corner where she could hide. He dragged her inside, the heavy front door closing behind them with an echoing boom. The interior was cold and sterile, all white marble and chrome, smelling faintly of lemon polish and her own fear. He didn't stop until they were in the center of the vast living room, the city lights twinkling like indifferent stars through the panoramic windows. He finally released her, shoving her away from him. She stumbled, catching herself on the edge of a glass coffee table. "Do you have any idea what you did?" he asked, his voice still deceptively soft. He began to pace, his expensive shoes clicking on the marble floor. It was a predator's walk, a lion circling its cornered prey. "You embarrass me. You undermine me. You reached out and touched that filth." He spat the last word, his face twisting in disgust. "I provide you with this." He gestured around the opulent room. "A beautiful home, clothes, jewels, a life other women would kill for. And you repay me by throwing yourself at some leather-clad degenerate at a gas station." Nina stayed silent, her eyes fixed on a point on the floor. Don't engage. Don't provoke. Survive. That was her mantra, but her silence only seemed to fuel his rage. He stopped in front of her, leaning in close. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he hissed. She forced her head up, her gaze meeting his. His eyes were black with fury. "You think they can help you?" He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Those animals? They see you as a piece of meat. I see you as a work of art. My art. And my art doesn't get to have its own opinions. It doesn't get to cry for help." He reached out and stroked her cheek with the back of his hand, a chillingly tender gesture that made her skin crawl. "We need to fix this. We need to remind you of the rules." His hand slid from her cheek to her throat, his fingers wrapping loosely around her neck. "Rule number 1, he said, his thumb pressing against her pulse point. "You belong to me. There is no before me. There is no after me. There's only me." As his grip began to tighten, the pristine, cold room seemed to dissolve around Nina, replaced by a memory, a warmer, sunnier place that now felt like a lifetime ago. It was a flashback to their third date, a picnic in a sun-drenched vineyard. Richard had been the epitome of charm, quoting poetry and laughing at her clumsy jokes. He'd listened, truly listened, or so she'd thought, as she talked about her dreams of opening a small bookstore cafe. He'd looked at her with such adoration, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You're too brilliant to be working for anyone else," he had said, taking her hand. "Let me help you. I can set you up, give you the freedom to create." It had been so seductive. He had painted a future for her That was everything she'd ever wanted. The first warning sign had been subtle. He had convinced her to quit her job, arguing that she needed to focus on the business plan. Then he'd insisted she move into his mansion, claiming it was more practical while they looked for the perfect location for a cafe. Slowly, methodically, he had severed her ties to the outside world. Her friends were jealous, and a bad influence her family was trying to hold her back. The bookstore cafe was always just around the corner, delayed by zoning issues, by paperwork, by a market that wasn't quite right. The promises became vaguer, the excuses more frequent, until the dream itself was just another tool he used to control her. The first time he'd hit her, it had been a slap. It had been after she'd had lunch with an old college friend without telling him. The shock had been as painful as the sting on her cheek. He had cried afterward, begging for her forgiveness, swearing it would never happen again. He bought her a diamond bracelet the next day. She had believed him. She had wanted to believe him. But it did happen again. And again. The slaps became punches. The apologies became shorter, then disappeared altogether, replaced by cold justifications. It was for her own good. She was being hysterical. She had provoked him. The gilded cage had been built around her so slowly, so expertly, that she hadn't even realized she was trapped until the door had been locked and the key thrown away. His fingers tightened around her throat now, pulling her back to the terrifying present. Her lungs screamed for air. Black spots danced at her vision. Rule number 2, he breathed, his face inches from hers. There is no help coming. He held her there for a few seconds longer, just long enough for the true, abject terror to set in, for her body to begin to thrash weakly. Then, just as suddenly, he released her. She collapsed to the floor, gasping, choking, dragging air into her burning lungs. He stood over her, looking down with an expression of detached satisfaction, like a scientist observing a specimen. "You are an investment, Nina," he said coolly, adjusting his tie. "And I always protect my investments. Now go upstairs. I don't want to see you again until morning." She scrambled away from him on her hands and knees, not daring to stand until she was out of his immediate reach. She fled up the sweeping staircase, her sobs silent, her body shaking uncontrollably. She didn't stop until she was in the bathroom, the door locked behind her. She stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger, with wild, terrified eyes and the faint red marks of Richard's fingers blooming on her neck. The hope she had felt at the gas station seemed like a cruel joke. He was right. There was no help coming. The fortress was too strong, the man too powerful. She was utterly, completely alone. But as she slid down to the cold tile floor, a single image pushed through the fog of her despair. The solid, leather-clad arm of the biker. The weight of his presence. The way he had looked at her, not with pity, but with a flicker of something else. Recognition. Anger. She clung to that image, a tiny, flickering ember in the overwhelming darkness. It probably meant nothing. It was probably just a fleeting moment. But for tonight, it was all she had. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the slow crawl of headlights from the occasional passing car. From their vantage point in the woods, the Sterling mansion was a silent, brightly lit stage. Rook and Grizz remained motionless beside their bikes, a testament to the ironclad patience drilled into them by years on the road and a life outside the lines of the law. The cold night air seeped into their bones, but they ignored it. Discomfort was temporary. Their purpose was not. Grizz shifted his weight, the leather of his pants creaking in the stillness. "He hasn't turned a single light off." "Rook," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "It's like a damn showroom. It's for her," Rook replied, not taking his eyes off the house. "So she knows there's nowhere to hide. Every window is an eye." The thought sent a chill down Rook's spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was a familiar chill, a ghost from a past he could never outrun. He closed his eyes, and the sterile, modern mansion was replaced by a small, cluttered apartment from 15 years ago. The smell of stale beer and cheap air freshener filled his senses. He was 22, all raw-boned anger and misguided pride, wearing a prospect's vest that still felt new. He was standing in the doorway of his little sister's apartment. Chloe. Her name was a scar on his soul. She was 2 years younger than him, with the same pale blue eyes but a smile that could light up a room. That day, her smile was gone. It had been replaced by a faint purple bruise on her cheekbone, which she tried to hide with her hair. Her boyfriend, a slick-talking bartender named Kevin, stood behind her, his arm draped possessively over her shoulder. "Everything's fine, Rook," she'd said, her voice unnaturally bright. "Kev and I just had a silly argument." You know how it is, Rook hadn't known how it was. He'd looked at Kevin, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, and a primal rage had boiled up inside him. He'd wanted to tear him apart. "You lay a hand on her again," Rook had snarled, taking a step forward. But Chloe had jumped in front of him, her hands on his chest. "Stop it. You'll make it worse. Please just go. We're fine. I promise." He had looked at his sister, at the desperation in her eyes, and he had hesitated. He was a prospect, trying to prove himself to the club, trying to walk the line. Starting a war over a domestic dispute was frowned upon. He was told to be smart, not just strong. So he backed down. He let her convince him. He had chosen the club's cautious approval over his own gut instinct. "You call me if you need anything," he'd said, his voice lame even to his own ears. "Anything at all." He'd walked away, the feeling of failure a stone in his stomach. He told himself she was an adult, that she could make her own choices. He told himself he had offered help, and she had refused it. He had lied to himself. 3 weeks later, the call came. It wasn't from Chloe. It was from the hospital. An accidental fall down the stairs, Kevin had claimed. She'd held on for 2 days in a coma before she was gone. The club had helped him find Kevin. They had delivered their own brand of justice in a dark alley, a brutal reckoning that had left the bartender broken and bleeding, but hadn't brought Chloe back. It hadn't silenced the voice in Rook's head that screamed he had failed her. He had stood at her grave and sworn an oath, not to God, but to her memory. Never again would he hesitate. Never again would he walk away. That oath was the foundation of his presidency. It was the unwritten law of his chapter. They didn't just wear the patch. They were protectors of the forgotten, the voiceless, the one society looked away from. They were the monsters who hunted the real monsters. Rook, Grizz's voice pulled him from the depths of the memory. He opened his eyes. The mansion was still there, a monument to the same evil that had taken his sister. His hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles aching. "I'm good," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Just thinking Grizz didn't press. He knew the story of Chloe. Every patch member did. It was part of their chapter's lore, the tragedy that forged their leader's iron will. He placed a heavy hand on Rook's shoulder. "We're not walking away from this one, brother, no." Rook agreed, his voice hardening into steel. "We're not." A flicker of movement in the house caught his eye. A light had gone on in an upstairs window on the far right. A silhouette moved behind the curtain. It was her, Nina. They watched as she paced back and forth, a small, frantic shadow in a box of light. Then, the silhouette of a man, larger and broader, appeared behind her. He grabbed her, and the two figures struggled for a moment before they disappeared from view. The light stayed on. "He's got her up there," Grizz growled, his whole body tense. "That's the room." Rook's phone buzzed. It was Chopper. "Talk to me. I'm in." Chopper's voice was triumphant. "Took a while. This guy's got firewalls on top of firewalls. But he made a mistake. His smart fridge has a Wi-Fi connection with a default password. I'm piggybacking off his grocery list and into his entire home network. I've got access to the security camera feeds. All 12 of them." A grim smile touched Rook's lips. "Good work. Send me the layout. Mark the cameras, the blind spots, and give me the security patrol's rotation already on it. Sending you a floor plan now. And get this, the patrol is a private firm, Aegis Security ex-military, but not top tier. Looks like they do one perimeter walk every hour on the hour. 2 guys. Predictable is good," Rook said. "What about inside?" "That's the tricky part," Chopper admitted. "There are no cameras inside the house itself, just perimeter. He's a privacy freak. But I'm seeing pressure sensors on the doors and windows. If a window breaks or a door is forced, a silent alarm goes directly to his personal security chief. Not the cops. A guy named Peterson, Rook absorbed the information, his mind already assembling the puzzle pieces. Private security, predictable patrols, no internal cameras, a silent alarm to a personal chief of staff. This was a prison designed to keep one person in, not an army out. It was arrogant, and arrogance created weaknesses. Keep digging, Chopper. I want to know everything about this, Peterson. And keep a live feed of those cameras running. I want to know the second anything changes. Rook hung up and looked at the illuminated diagram of the house on his phone screen. He saw the master bedroom, right where they had seen the light. He saw the single, long driveway. He saw the high walls. But now he also saw the blind spots. The stretch of wall at the back of the property where the trees grew thickest. The 3-minute window between the patrol passing the rear gate and reaching the front. He made a mistake, Grizz, Rook said, showing the screen to his friend. He built a cage with a faulty lock. Grizz grinned, a feral baring of teeth in the darkness. Then I guess it's time we let the bird out. Their vigil continued, but now it was different. It was no longer a passive watch. It was the final survey before the siege. Every shadow, every sound, was now a piece of the plan, a step on the path to the front door of Richard Sterling's private hell. The clubhouse was thick with the smell of stale beer, motor oil, and old leather. It was a scent that Rook usually found comforting, the smell of home. Tonight, it felt like the air in a war room before a major offensive. The long wooden table that served as the centerpiece of the main room was covered in printed satellite images and handwritten notes. Chopper, a wiry man with glasses perched on his nose and fingers that seemed to be permanently stained with ink and grease, pointed a laser at a blueprint of the Sterling mansion projected onto the far wall. Every patch member of the chapter was present, their faces grim and focused in the dim light. "Okay, listen up." Rook's voice cut through the low murmur. The room fell silent. "You all heard the situation from Grizz. A woman reached out. She's in trouble. The man holding her is Richard Sterling. He's rich, he's connected, and he's a monster. This is not a smash and grab. This is a surgical extraction. We go in clean, we get her out, and we disappear. The goal is her safety, not a street fight." He paced in front of the projection, his shadow falling across the blueprint. "Chopper, walk them through the ingress." Chopper adjusted his glasses. "The property is walled 10 feet high, with razor wire on top. However, he used the laser pointer to circle a section at the far back of the estate. There's a 50-yard stretch here where the wall adjoins a nature preserve. It's overgrown, and one of the security cameras in that sector has been on the fritz for a week, according to the system logs. He's logged a service call, but the ticket is still open. That's our way in." A biker named Breaker, a man with arms as thick as tree trunks, grunted. "What about the wire?" "We don't go over it. We go through it," Chopper said, a sly grin on his face. "I've been studying the construction photos from when the wall was built. It's reinforced concrete, but the foundation is standard. Grizz and I will take a hydraulic spreader, the Jaws of Life we acquired last year. We can create a gap at the base of one of the panels, just big enough to slip through. It'll be slow, but it'll be silent." Rook nodded in approval. "Once we're on the grounds, we have a 3-minute window. The Aegis Patrol passes the rear corner at 13 minutes past the hour. They reach the front gate at 16 minutes past. We move in that window. Team 1 is Breaker, Stitch, and Hammer. Your job is the guards. You're not to engage lethally. You neutralize, you bind them, you hide them. Use the tranquilizer darts Chopper prepared. They're expecting deer, not us. Make it look like they fell asleep on the job. We want Sterling to think his security is incompetent, not that he was invaded." Breaker cracked his massive knuckles. "Quiet as a church mouse, boss. Team 2. Rook continued, his gaze falling on Grizz. "Is you and me. We are the extraction team. We go straight for the house. Chopper has confirmed the location of the master suite. 2nd floor, southeast corner. There's a terrace. That's our entry point. Doors and windows are wired," Grizz noted, pointing at the blueprint. "Pressure sensors, not the terrace doors," Chopper interjected. "He uses them to go out and smoke his expensive cigars. The sensor is on a manual bypass that he often forgets to re-engage. I've been monitoring the system. It's been off for 2 days straight. We can use a glass cutter to take out a pane near the handle and open it from the outside. No noise, no alarm. The plan was intricate, layered. It was a testament to the fact that they were more than just brutes on bikes. They were soldiers. Rook paused, letting the details sink in. There is one major wrinkle. A man named Peterson. He's Sterling's chief of security, an ex-cop who was fired for excessive force. He doesn't live on site, but he's on call 24/7. If any of the internal alarms are tripped, the signal goes directly to his phone. If that happens, he'll be there in 15 minutes with his own private army of thugs. So, I repeat, we must be ghosts. No mistakes. He looked around the table, meeting the eyes of every man there. Once we have her, we fall back the way we came. We exfil to the safe house over the garage. Sonia is on her way. She's a registered nurse. She'll know what to do. Sonia was an old friend of the club, a tough-as-nails ER nurse who had patched them up more times than they could count and never asked any questions. What about him? Stitch asked, his youthful face tight with anger. Sterling. We just let him walk. Rook stopped pacing and stared at the projected image of the house. Sterling's punishment comes later, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low growl. Tonight is about her. Once she's safe, we begin Phase 2. And Phase 2 is dismantling Richard Sterling's entire world. We will find every dirty secret, every illegal deal, every skeleton in his closet. We will leak it to the press, to his business rivals, to the IRS. We won't just break his bones. We will break his company, his reputation, and his spirit. We will leave him with nothing but the memory of what he lost because he dared to put his hands on an innocent woman. When we are done with him, he will wish all we did was kill him. A low, affirmative growl went through the room. This was a language they all understood. It wasn't just about vengeance. It was about a complete and total eradication of a threat. It was about ensuring he could never hurt anyone ever again. All right. Rook clapped his hands together. It's 0100 hours. The next patrol window opens at 0213. We move out in 30 minutes. Check your gear. Check your comms. No boost. We do this sober. We do this smart. Any questions? The room was silent. The plan was clear. Their purpose was absolute. Grizz walked over to Rook as the others began to disperse, grabbing gear and running final checks. You're thinking about her, aren't you? Grizz said quietly. Chloe. Rook didn't answer for a moment. He just stared at the blueprint, at the room marked Master Suite. I'm thinking, he said, his voice thick with a pain that never truly went away. That this time, I'm kicking the goddamn door down. Grizz put a hand on his shoulder, the same way he had hours earlier in the Coldwoods. It was a gesture of unwavering solidarity. You're not alone this time, brother, I know, Rook said, and for the first time that night, he looked away from the plans and directly at his friend, his brother in arms. Let's go bring her home. The 30 minutes passed in a flurry of focused, silent activity. Vests were tightened, boots were laced, and communications were tested with quiet clicks and whispered acknowledgments. There was no bravado, no posturing. There was only the cold, hard resolve of men on a mission. As they filed out of the clubhouse and mounted their bikes, the moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, plunging the world into a deep, inky blackness. It was a predator's moon. They didn't roar down the street. They rolled out quietly, their powerful engines held to a low, throaty rumble, a pack of steel wolves slipping unseen into the night. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of damp leaves and tangled roots. The air was heavy and still, carrying the scent of pine and rich earth. Rook's team moved through the darkness with a practiced silence that defied their size. They were shadows among shadows, communicating with a series of clicks and hand signals honed over years of writing and fighting together. They reached the base of the massive concrete wall, a sheer, insurmountable cliff in the gloom. Chopper was already at work, his small frame hunched over the hydraulic spreader. The tool, normally used by firefighters to pry open crushed cars, was repurposed for a different kind of rescue. There was no whining motor, only the faint, rhythmic creak of the manual pump as Grizz, using his immense strength, slowly forced the steel jaws of the spreader into the seam between the wall panel and its foundation. Sweat beaded on Grizz's forehead despite the cold. It was grueling, precise work. Too much pressure too quickly could send a shock wave through the concrete, making a noise that could carry. Too little, and they would be there all night. Rook stood guard, his eyes scanning the top of the wall, his ears straining for any sound out of place. His senses were on fire, every nerve ending tingling with adrenaline. He could hear the faint hum of the electricity in the razor wire above, the distant hoot of an owl, the frantic beating of his own heart. Finally, after 10 agonizing minutes that felt like an eternity, there was a low groan of stressed concrete and a soft crunch of earth. A gap, no more than 2 feet high, had opened at the base of the wall. It was just enough. Go, Rook whispered into his calm. Stitch, the youngest and slimmest, went first, wriggling through the opening like an eel. He emerged on the other side and immediately took up a defensive position, his tranquilizer pistol at the ready. Hammer followed, then Breaker. Their objective was a small security shed located 50 yards to their left, where the 2 guards, Peterson's men, would take their break after their patrol. Team 1 melted into the manicured landscape of the estate, their dark clothes making them all but invisible against the sculpted hedges and ancient oak trees. Rook checked his watch. 0212. 1 minute, he breathed. He looked at Grizz. The big man nodded, his face set like stone. They slid through the gap, one after the other, and Chopper followed, pulling the spreader out behind him. The wall was breached. Now the clock was ticking. Rook led the way, his feet making no sound on the lush grass. They moved in a low crouch, using the deep shadows cast by the trees as their cover. Up ahead, he saw Breaker give a 2-fingered signal. The guards were neutralized. Team 1 had done its job. Rook and Grizz continued their advance toward the house. It rose before them, a monolith of glass and light, silent and imposing. It felt like approaching a sleeping dragon. They reached the edge of the sprawling stone patio at the rear of the house. Rook peered around the corner of a large terracotta planter. The terrace of the master suite was directly above them, about 15 feet up. A thick, gnarled ivy grew up the stone wall, its ancient vines as thick as a man's wrist. It was a natural ladder. That's our way up, Rook whispered. Grizz nodded, his eyes already tracing the path. I'll go first. Cover me. Grizz moved to the wall, his big hands testing the strength of the vines. They were solid, deeply rooted in the stone. He began to climb, his movements surprisingly agile for a man of his size. He moved with the quiet confidence of a bear, his massive frame blending into the tapestry of shadow and ivy. Rook stayed below, his weapon trained on the windows and doors, watching for any sign of movement, any flicker of a light, any indication that they had been discovered. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves as Grizz ascended. Grizz reached the terrace railing and hauled himself over with a single, powerful motion. He dropped into a crouch, instantly scanning the area. He gave Rook the all-clear signal. Rook followed, climbing the ivy with a wiry grace. He joined Grizz on the terrace, his heart pounding. They were in. They were on the dragon's back. The glass doors leading into the bedroom were closed. Just as Chopper had predicted, a small green light on the security panel next to the door was unlit, indicating the sensor was off. Rook pulled a small, suction-cup glass cutter from his belt. This was the most delicate part of the operation. He attached the suction cup to the pane of glass closest to the handle, scored a neat circle, and then used a small tool to apply pressure. With a faint click, the circle of glass broke free. He carefully removed it, placing it silently on the stone floor of the terrace. The night air was cool, but sweat trickled down his temple. He reached a gloved hand through the opening, his fingers finding the smooth, cold metal of the handle. He turned it slowly, praying it wouldn't squeak. The latch disengaged with a barely audible snick. He pushed the door open an inch, then another, peering into the darkness of the room. The room was not completely dark. A sliver of light from the en-suite bathroom cast long, distorted shadows across the floor. In the center of the room was a massive, king-sized bed, and in the bed, a figure was curled into a tight ball, facing away from them. Nina. Rook could hear the faint, hitching sound of her crying. The sound was a dagger in his heart. It fueled the cold fire in his belly. Lying on the other side of the bed, sprawled on his back on top of the covers, was Richard Sterling. He was fast asleep, one arm thrown over his head, breathing deeply. An empty glass and a half-empty bottle of scotch sat on a nightstand beside him. Rook and Grizz exchanged a look. This was their chance. A perfect scenario. They could get her out without him ever waking up. Grizz moved first, a silent giant creeping across the plush carpet. His target was Sterling. Rook moved to the other side of the bed, his movements fluid and silent. He knelt beside the bed, his face just inches from Nina. "Nina," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. She flinched violently, a terrified gasp escaping her lips. She scrambled backward, her eyes wide with panic in the dim light. She didn't see a savior. She saw another monster looming out of the darkness. "No, no, please," she whimpered, her voice raw from crying. "It's okay," Rook said, keeping his voice low and calm, holding his hands up to show he was unarmed. "We're the men from the gas station. We're here to get you out." Her terrified eyes flickered from his face to the patch on his vest, which was just visible in the gloom. The winged skull. Recognition dawned, but it was mixed with disbelief and overwhelming fear. On the other side of the bed, Sterling stirred. He mumbled something in his sleep and rolled over, facing them. Grizz froze, his hand hovering over the man's mouth, a chloroform-soaked rag ready. Sterling's eyes fluttered open. For a split second, they were clouded with sleep. Then they focused on the massive shape of Grizz looming over him. Comprehension and fury flashed across his face simultaneously. He opened his mouth to shout. The silent, surgical extraction shattered into 1,000 pieces of chaos. Before Richard Sterling could utter a sound, Grizz's hand, a slab of meat and calloused knuckles, clamped over his mouth. The chloroform rag was pressed firmly against his nose. Sterling's eyes went wide with panic and rage. He thrashed, his body bucking on the bed, his muffled grunts of fury filling the room. He was stronger than he looked, fueled by pure, narcissistic indignation. His flailing leg kicked out, catching a bedside lamp and sending it crashing to the floor. The sound was like a thunderclap in the silent house. "Damn it," Grizz grunted, using his full weight to pin Sterling to the mattress. "He's not going down easy." Rook ignored the struggle. His only focus was Nina. The crash had sent her into a fresh spiral of terror. She was huddled against the headboard, her hands over her ears, her body trembling uncontrollably. "Nina, look at me," Rook commanded, his voice sharp but steady, cutting through her panic. "We have to go." Now, downstairs, a new sound began to slice through the night. A high-pitched, piercing alarm. It wasn't the main security system. It was something else. A personal panic alarm. "Rook, we got a problem." Chopper's voice crackled urgently in his earpiece. That wasn't the main alarm. He must have had a secondary panic button by the bed. It just pinged Peterson's phone directly. "The clock is ticking. You got 15 minutes, maybe less 15 minutes. An eternity and no time at all." Sterling finally went limp under Grizz's grip, his body slumping as the chloroform did its work. But the damage was done. Help was coming, but it was the wrong kind of help. "Grizz, get him tied up and gagged. Use the curtains. Make sure he's secure," Rook ordered, his mind racing. He turned back to Nina. He couldn't afford to be gentle anymore. He grabbed her by the shoulders. "Nina, there's no more time. We have to move." His touch, firm and unyielding, seemed to break through her frozen state. She looked at him, her eyes a maelstrom of fear and a tiny, flickering spark of hope. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Peterson, he'll kill you. Let him try," Rook growled. "But he's not going to get the chance if you come with me right now." He pulled her from the bed, her body still shaking. She was wearing a thin silk nightgown, no match for the cold night. Rook stripped off his own leather jacket, the one without the club patches, and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was heavy and warm and smelled of gasoline and the open road. It was the most comforting thing she had felt in years. "Team 1, what's your status?" Rook barked into his comms. Two cars just pulled up out front. Breaker's voice came back tense. No sit-ins. For men. Black SUVs. They're armed. Peterson's private army had arrived early. The carefully laid plan was officially shot. This was now a fighting retreat. Lock down the front, Rook ordered. Don't let them in the house. Buy us time. We're coming out the back. Copy that, Breaker responded. The sound of a muffled scuffle and a heavy thud came over the comms. Team 1 was engaging. Rook grabbed Nina's hand. Her skin was ice cold. We're leaving the way we came. Grizz, you with me? Grizz finished securing Sterling to the bedpost with a ripped curtain, a gag stuffed in his mouth. He gave a not a final, vicious tug. Right behind you, boss. They moved back toward the terrace, Rook pulling Nina along with him. As they reached the open glass door, the sound of splintering would erupted from downstairs, followed by shouting. Peterson's men were trying to breach the front door. The fight was on. Grizz stepped onto the terrace first, his eyes scanning the grounds below. Clear for now, he said. He looked at the ivy-covered wall. She can't climb down that, he was right. In her state, it was impossible. Then we go down another way, Rook said, his eyes landing on the thick, stone railing of the terrace. He pulled a length of thin, high-tensile rope from a pouch on his belt. It was part of their emergency gear, strong enough to hold a truck. He looped it around the base of the railing, securing it with a quick, practice knot. Grizz, you rappel down with her. I'll cover you, Grizz nodded. He was the heavier of the two, better able to control the descent with a passenger. He turned to Nina, his expression softening slightly. I've got you, he said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. Don't look down. Just hold on to me. He wrapped one arm around her waist, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. Nina cried out, clinging to his thick neck, burying her face in his shoulder. Grizz backed up to the edge of the terrace, the rope in his gloved hand, and began to lower them over the side. Rook stood guard at the door, his weapon raised, listening to the sounds of the battle raging inside the house. He could hear Breaker's distinctive roar, the crash of furniture, the grunts of men locked in brutal combat. His men were buying them precious seconds with their own blood and bone. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the far end of the upstairs hallway, framed in a doorway. It was one of Peterson's men, a burly thug in a black tactical vest, holding a pistol. He must have found another way in, a side window or a back door. The man raised his weapon, aiming it at Grizz and Nina, who were now halfway down the wall, a perfect, dangling target. There was no time to think. Rook fired. His shot was a single, deafening crack in the night. The thug grunted, his own gun firing into the ceiling as he staggered backward, clutching his shoulder. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight. But the gunshot had given away their position. Shouts from below indicated that the other thugs were now circling around to the back of the house. Grizz and Nina touched down on the grass. Go! Move to the wall! Rook yelled, providing covering fire, sending shots toward the corner of the house to keep the other men from advancing. He didn't wait for a reply. He grabbed the rope, and with the lithe grace of a panther, he swung over the railing and slid down, the rope burning against his gloves. He hit the ground running. He caught up to Grizz and Nina at the edge of the tree line. Grizz had her shielded behind his massive body, pushing her toward the relative safety of the woods. Chopper, we need a distraction at the front gate. Now, Rook yelled into his comm, already on it, came the reply. A second later, a massive explosion of light and sound erupted from the front of the property. Chopper had hot-wired the circuit breaker for the main gate and the exterior lighting, creating a massive electrical surge. The gate's motor exploded in a shower of sparks, and every light on the property blew out simultaneously, plunging the entire estate into absolute, disorienting darkness. They used the precious seconds of confusion to their advantage, sprinting through the woods toward the breach in the wall. Behind them, they could hear confused shouts and the beams of flashlights cutting wildly through the blackness. Hammer, Stitch, fall back. Now, Rook commanded. They reached the gap in the wall. Grizz pushed Nina through first, then scrambled after her. Rook was the last one through, his gun still trained on the darkness of the estate. He could see the flashlight beams getting closer. He backed through the opening, and together, He and Grizz used their combined strength to force the damaged section of the wall back into place. It wasn't perfect, but it would slow them down. They didn't wait to see if it held. They ran. They crashed through the underbrush of the nature preserve, driven by pure adrenaline, the sounds of the pursuit fading behind them. They burst out onto the deserted road where their bikes were hidden. Hammer and Stitch were already there, bruised and breathing heavily, but alive. Breaker was a few yards away, leaning against a tree, a nasty gash on his forehead. "Everyone clear?" Rook demanded, his chest heaving. Nods all around. He turned to Nina. She was leaning against Grizz's bike, still wrapped in Rook's jacket, her body racked with tremors. But she was safe. She was out. He walked over to her, his face grim. "It's over," he said softly. "He can't hurt you anymore." She looked up at him, her face pale in the faint starlight, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. For the first time, the tears weren't from fear or pain. They were from relief. A wave of exhaustion, so profound it was almost paralyzing, washed over her. Her legs gave out, and she would have collapsed if Rook hadn't caught her, pulling her into a firm, protective embrace. She buried her face in his chest, her small hands clutching the front of his vest, and she finally let out the scream that had been trapped inside her for years. It was a sound of pure, raw, cathartic release. Rook just held her, his arms a steel cage of protection, as the Hell's Angels, bruised but victorious, closed ranks around them, a silent circle of leather-clad guardians under the dark and silent sky. The ride to the safe house was a blur of roaring engines and wind. Nina was on the back of Rook's bike, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, her face pressed against the solid wall of his back. The vibrations of the powerful machine seemed to seep into her bones, a grounding, physical reality that was the absolute opposite of the sterile, silent terror of Richard's world. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she wasn't a passenger in a hermetically sealed luxury car. She was part of the storm, moving with it, surrounded by it. The thunder of the Harleys was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of her escape. They didn't go back to the main clubhouse. Instead, they pulled into a narrow, unmarked alley behind a row of warehouses in the industrial district. A heavy steel door slid open, and they drove directly into a large, cavernous garage filled with bikes in various states of repair. This was the club's sanctum sanctorum, a place not even their closest associates knew about. A steep metal staircase led up to a loft apartment. At the top, a woman was waiting. She had fiery red hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, kind but no-nonsense eyes, and arms covered in colorful, faded tattoos. This was Sonia, the ER nurse. She took one look at Nina, at her pale face, the marks on her neck, and the haunted look in her eyes, and her expression softened with a professional empathy that was both comforting and efficient. "Let's get you inside," Sonia said, her voice calm and steady. She gently took Nina's arm, leading her away from the bikers and into the apartment. The space was surprisingly cozy, with worn leather couches, a small kitchen, and a clean, warm scent of coffee and antiseptic. It was a haven. Sonia led Nina to a small, clean bathroom. "I'm just going to check you over, okay? I'm a nurse. You're safe here." Nina could only nod, her throat tight with unshed tears. For so long, every touch had been a threat, every examination a judgment. Sonia's hands were gentle and professional as she checked Nina's bruised arms, the raw skin on her wrists where Richard had grabbed her, and the angry red marks on her neck. She cleaned a small cut on Nina's cheek that she hadn't even realized she had. "No broken bones, for what I can tell," Sonia said softly. "Just some nasty bruising. You're going to be sore for a while." She handed Nina a soft, oversized t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants. "Get out those clothes. A hot shower will help with the shaking." While Nina was in the shower, letting the hot water wash away the last remnants of Richard's world, the bikers gathered in the main room of the loft. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a grim exhaustion and simmering rage. Breaker was getting the gash on his forehead stitched up by Sonia, who moved back and forth between her two patients with practiced ease. He didn't even flinch as the needle pierced his skin. Peterson's crew was tougher than expected, Breaker grunted. Ex-Rangers, I'd bet. They knew how to fight, but they don't know how to win, Grizz added, a dark satisfaction in his voice. They fight for a paycheck. We fight for family. Rook was standing by the window, looking down at the dark, empty street. His mind was already on the next phase. The rescue was complete, but the war was just beginning. Chopper, he said without turning around. What's the fallout? Chopper was typing furiously on a ruggedized laptop. Police responded to a security alarm at the Sterling residence about 20 minutes ago. Sterling is claiming a home invasion. He's telling them it was a professional crew, highly organized. He's shaken, but he's sticking to his story. What about her? Rook asked, his voice tight. He hasn't mentioned her. At all, Chopper said, looking up from his screen. As far as the official police report is concerned, he was the only one home. He's not reporting a kidnapping. Rook turned from the window, a cold, dangerous light in his eyes. Of course not, because to report her missing, he'd have to admit she existed. He'd have to answer questions. His perfect, curated world would start to unravel. He's cutting his losses. He's burying her, pretending she was never there. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it hung in the air. Richard wasn't just an abuser. He was a sociopath, capable of erasing a human being from his life as easily as deleting a file. Nina emerged from the bathroom, her small frame swallowed by the large T-shirt. Her hair was damp, and the color was starting to return to her cheeks. She looked fragile, but the wild terror in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, profound weariness. She stopped in the doorway, looking at the formidable group of men. They all fell silent, their rough edges seeming to soften in her presence. Rook walked over to her. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space. How are you feeling? He asked. Clean, she whispered, the single word holding a universe of meaning. He nodded, understanding completely. Good. That's a start. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke again, his voice lower, more personal. I'm sorry for what you went through, and I'm sorry it took us so long to get to you. Nina looked up at him, her gaze meeting his. You came, she said, her voice thick with emotion. That's all that matters. You came. An unspoken understanding passed between them. It was an understanding forged in shared trauma, a recognition of the darkness that lived in the world and the will to fight against it. Rook knew he had to tell her. She deserved to know why he had looked at her with such recognition, why her plight had become his crusade. I had a sister, he began, his voice rough. Her name was Chloe. She was in a situation like yours. With a man like him, he didn't look at Nina as he spoke, his eyes fixed on a distant point, lost in the memory. I didn't act. I hesitated. I told myself it was her life, her choice. I waited, and by the time I stopped waiting, it was too late. He finally looked at her, his pale blue eyes filled with a pain that was 15 years old but still raw. When Grizz told me what you said, what he saw in your eyes, I saw my sister, and I made a promise to her that I would never hesitate again. Tonight, this was for her, too. Tears welled in Nina's eyes, but this time they were for him, for the sister he had lost, for the pain he still carried. She took a hesitant step forward and did something that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, on the leather of his vest. Thank you for not hesitating, she whispered. In that moment, something shifted. The chasm between the victim and the savior disappeared, replaced by a bridge of shared humanity. He had saved her life, but in doing so, she was beginning to save him from the ghost that had haunted him for so long. Rook placed his hand over hers, his calloused fingers gently covering her smaller ones. It wasn't a gesture of ownership or control. It was a promise, a vow of protection. Now, he said, his voice regaining its hard edge as he looked back at his men. We begin phase 2. Chopper, I want you to start digging. I want every piece of filth on Richard Sterling you can find. Financial records, offshore accounts, jilted ex-lovers, disgruntled former employees. Burn every source you have. I want to build a fire so big it burns his entire empire to the ground. A predatory grin spread across Chopper's face. With pleasure, boss, the Hell's Angels had rescued the princess from the tower. Now, They were going to tear the whole damn castle down, stone by stone. The days that followed were a strange mixture of quiet healing and methodical warfare. The loft above the garage became Nina's sanctuary. Sonia stayed with her, a constant, reassuring presence. She slept more than she had in years, deep, dreamless sleeps uninterrupted by fear. She ate the simple, hearty meals the bikers brought up to her. Chili from a slow cooker, thick sandwiches, and endless cups of strong, hot coffee. She spoke when she wanted to, which wasn't often at first. Mostly, she listened. She listened to the low rumble of conversations from the garage below, the sound of tools clinking against metal, the sudden bursts of rough laughter. These sounds, which once would have terrified her, became her new lullaby. They were the sounds of her guardians. Downstairs, Rook's war room was in full operation. Chopper worked relentlessly, his corner of the garage looking like a hacker's den from a spy movie, with multiple monitors displaying scrolling lines of code and complex financial data. He was a digital phantom, slipping through the cracks of Richard Sterling's meticulously constructed life, and what he found was uglier than any of them had imagined. "This guy is dirtier than a New York sewer," Chopper announced one afternoon, spinning around in his chair. Rook, Grizz, and Breaker gathered around his monitors. "He's not just a bully. He's a crook on a massive scale. He's running a Ponzi scheme, using his legitimate financial firm as a front. He's laundering money for a Colombian cartel. He's got offshore accounts in the Caymans that are fatter than a Christmas goose." He pointed to another screen. "And that's not the half of it. I found 2 other women, ex-friends. Both signed ironclad NDAs and received massive settlements after accidents. One fell off his yacht. The other had a skiing accident. Both left the country immediately after getting paid. The pieces all fit together. Richard wasn't just an abuser. He was a predator who used his wealth and power to silence and dispose of anyone who threatened him." "Can you prove it?" Rook asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "The money laundering? I got the transaction logs. Encrypted, but I can break them." "It'll take time," Chopper said. "The Ponzi scheme is trickier. It's a house of cards. We need to get an inside look at his physical files to find the smoking gun. And as for the women, their NDAs are legal fortresses." Rook paced the concrete floor, his mind working. A public takedown was what he wanted. Utter humiliation. But it had to be done in a way that could never be traced back to them, or, more importantly, to Nina. He needed an angle. He needed a weapon. And then he remembered Sterling's Achilles heel, his own arrogance. His private security chief, Peterson. "Chopper, what did you find on Peterson?" Rook asked. Chopper pulled up another file. "Daniel Peterson, ex-MPD, dishonorably discharged for evidence tampering and perjury. He was on the take. Sterling must have him on a private retainer. He's loyal, but only to the money. Everyone has a price," Grizz grunted. "And everyone has a weakness," Rook corrected. "Peterson's weakness is that he thinks he's smarter than everyone else. He covered his tracks when he was a cop, but he got sloppy working for Sterling. Find his leverage. A gambling debt, a mistress, something the IRS doesn't know about. Something we can use to make him an offer he can't refuse, while the bikers plan their attack." Nina was taking her own first steps toward reclaiming her life. One afternoon, she was sitting on the worn leather couch, sketching in a notebook Sonia had given her, when Grizz came up the stairs. He held out a small, wriggling ball of fur. It was a puppy, a little brindle pit bull mix with floppy ears and enormous paws. "Found him in a box by the dumpster," Grizz said, his deep voice unusually gentle. "Thought he could use a home. And maybe you could use a friend." Nina looked at the puppy, then up at the massive, bearded biker. She saw the kindness in his eyes, the same kindness she'd seen that night at the gas station. She reached out and took the puppy. It immediately started licking her chin, its tail wagging furiously. A genuine smile, the first she'd had in years, spread across her face. A real smile, not the mask she had been forced to wear. She hugged the tiny creature to her chest, a feeling of pure, uncomplicated love blooming in her heart. "I'll call him Grizz," she said softly. The big biker blushed, a faint red creeping up from under his beard. "Nah," he mumbled. "Call him something better. Call him Tank. The puppy, Tank, became her shadow, her constant companion. Taking care of him gave her a purpose, a reason to get up in the morning. He was a living, breathing creature that depended on her, and in caring for him, she began to care for herself again. A week after the rescue, Rook came up to the loft. Nina was sitting on the floor, throwing a small rope toy for Tank. She looked up as he approached, no longer flinching at his presence. She looked stronger, the haunted look in her eyes slowly receding. "We're ready," Rook said, his voice low. "We found a way to take him down." All of it, he explained the plan. How Chopper had found Peterson's hidden gambling addiction and the six-figure debt he owed to a particularly unforgiving bookie. How they had made contact with the bookie and bought the debt. Peterson now worked for them. "He's going to walk into Sterling's office tonight and retrieve the files we need," Rook explained. "The original, untraceable paperwork for the Ponzi scheme. He's also going to plant a small gift from us, a flash drive containing the records of Sterling's money laundering operations. We've sent an anonymous tip to a very ambitious federal prosecutor. When the FBI raids his office tomorrow morning, they'll find everything they need to put him away for the rest of his life." Nina listened, her expression unreadable. This was it, the final act. Will he know it was me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No," Rook said firmly. "He'll think Peterson betrayed him for a bigger payout. He'll think one of his criminal associates turned on him. He will have a dozen enemies to blame. He will never think of you. In his mind, you're already gone. We're just making it official." She nodded slowly, processing the beautiful, brutal justice of it all. He had tried to erase her, and now he was the one who was about to be erased. "What about the other women?" she asked. "The ones who signed the NDAs. Chopper is sending them an anonymous email," Rook said. "It will contain proof that Sterling is being investigated for federal crimes. It will inform them that under these circumstances, their NDAs are likely void. It will also contain the contact information for a very good, very aggressive lawyer who specializes in suing powerful men. A lawyer whose retainer we've already paid." Nina looked at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of awe and gratitude. They hadn't just saved her. They were building a firewall to ensure he could never rise from the ashes, that he could never hurt anyone else. They were salting the earth. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate for the magnitude of what they had done. "You don't have to thank us," Rook said, his gaze softening. "We're family, and family takes care of its own." He knelt down, stroking Tank's head. "You're safe now, Nina. You're free. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" It was the first time anyone had asked her that question in years. For so long, her only goal had been to survive the next hour, the next day. The idea of a future, a real future that she could choose for herself, was a concept so vast and dazzling it was almost frightening. But as she looked at the biker who had pulled her from the abyss, and at the puppy cuddled in her lap, she felt a stirring of something she thought had died long ago, a dream. "I think," she said, a small, determined smile on her face, "I'm going to open a bookstore." 3 months later, the autumn air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of change. A grand opening banner flapped in the breeze above a newly renovated storefront on a quiet, tree-lined street. The sign, painted in elegant script, read, "The Next Chapter Bookstore and Cafe Inside." The store was filled with a wonderful smell of old paper and freshly brewed coffee. Bookshelves made of reclaimed wood were crammed with everything from classic literature to modern thrillers. Cozy armchairs were tucked into sunlit corners. It was exactly the store Nina had dreamed of, brought to life not by manipulative monsters' empty promises, but by her own hard work and resilience. She had used the settlement from her lawsuit against Richard, a suit filed by the aggressive lawyer the bikers had found for her, as the seed money. The bikers themselves had been her construction crew, their rough, calloused hands surprisingly adept at carpentry and painting. They had worked for free, fueled by coffee and Sonia's homemade lasagna, turning the dusty, empty space into a warm, inviting haven. Nina moved through the bustling crowd of the grand opening, a confident smile on her face. She was a different woman from the terrified, broken creature who had stumbled out of the Bentley 3 months ago. Her hair was cut in a stylish bob. She wore a bright, colorful dress, and her eyes, once hollow with fear, now sparkled with life and purpose. Tank, now a lanky adolescent pup, trotted happily at her heels, his tail wagging. The news of Richard Sterling's downfall had been spectacular. The FBI raid, the leaked documents, the parade of ruined investors, the damning testimony from his own security chief. It had all combined to create a media firestorm. His empire had crumbled to dust. His name had become a byword for greed and corruption. He had been denied bail and was now awaiting a trial that was a mere formality. He would spend the rest of his life in a cage far smaller and uglier than the one he had built for Nina. She saw Rook standing near the back of the store, leaning against a bookshelf, a cup of coffee in his hand. He was watching her, a rare, small smile on his face. He looked out of place in his leather vest amidst the cheerful crowd, but to Nina, he looked like he belonged there more than anyone. She walked over to him, Tank nudging his hand with a wet nose. "You came," she said, her smile widening. "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, his gravelly voice a familiar comfort. "The place looks good." "You did good, Nina. We did good," she corrected him gently. "I couldn't have done any of this without you. Without all of you." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the happy chaos of the store. Grizz was trying to fit his massive frame into one of the armchairs, much to the amusement of Breaker and Stitch. Chopper was arguing with Sonia about the merits of dystopian fiction versus classic romance novels. They weren't just her rescuers anymore. They were her friends, her family. "I heard about the charity ride next month," Nina said, changing the subject. "The one for the women's shelter," "Yeah," Rook said. "Annual thing. We raise a bit of money, make some noise. Remind people to pay attention. I want to help," Nina said firmly. "I'm not just going to donate money. I want to be there. I want to speak." Rook looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the steel in her spine, the fire in her eyes. The victim was gone, replaced by a survivor. "A warrior. Are you sure?" he asked. "You don't have to, I know," she said. "But I want to. If my story can help even one other woman realize that she's not alone, that there is help out there, then everything I went through will have meant something." He nodded slowly, a look of profound respect on his face. He had saved her from Richard Sterling, but she had saved herself. She had taken the shattered pieces of her life and built something new and beautiful. She had found her own way to fight back. "All right, warrior," he said, the name fitting her perfectly. "We'd be honored to have you." A month later, on a bright, sunny Saturday, a thunderous roar echoed through the city as over 100 motorcycles took to the streets. The Hells Angels led the charity ride, their patches gleaming in the sun. But this year the ride was different. It ended at a park, where a stage had been set up, and standing at the podium was Nina. She looked out at the crowd, bikers, families, supporters, and other survivors, and she began to speak. She told her story, not with tears or trembling, but with a clear, strong voice. She spoke of the darkness, but she focused on the light. She spoke of the despair, but she championed the hope. She spoke of the man who had tried to break her, but celebrated the brothers who had lifted her up. As she finished, the crowd rose to its feet in a wave of thunderous applause. Rook stood beside his bike, watching her, his heart full. He saw Chloe in Nina's strength, in her refusal to be silenced. His promise had been kept. His sister's memory had been honored. Nina walked off the stage and directly to him. She stood before him, the roar of the crowd fading into the background. "Thank you, Rook," she said, her voice filled with a depth of gratitude that went beyond words. "For seeing me always," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of pure, platonic friendship and unwavering respect. They had been brought together by violence and fear, a broken woman and a haunted man. But in the aftermath, they had found something far more powerful: redemption, purpose, and a new chapter, written not in blood and tears, but in hope and brotherhood. As the engines roared to life once more, the sound wasn't a threat, but a triumphant anthem of freedom, A promise that as long as men like them were willing to ride, no one would ever have to whisper for help into the darkness alone. The fight against evil is not always waged by saints in shining armor. Sometimes it is fought by outlaws in leather, by broken souls who refuse to let others suffer the same fate. If you see injustice, if you hear a cry for help that no one else seems to notice, be the one who listens. Be the one who acts. Share this story if you believe in the power of brotherhood, and comment below with your own stories of everyday heroes. Support your local women's shelters and advocacy groups, because the fight to protect the innocent belongs to all of us.